From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons.
Mitch McConnell says talks on the border continue despite pressure from former President Trump against a bill. The fate of aid for Ukraine potentially hanging in the balance.
We'll hear what Texas Governor Greg Abbott has to say on immigration, and Kyle Kondik of Sabato's Crystal Ball will tell us how it's factoring into this election cycle.
Plus, fourth quarter GDP soaring past all expectations and another positive sign for the Biden administration. We'll hear from senior advisor to the president, Gene Sperling, along with Betsey Stevenson of the University of Michigan. It's another piece in the puzzle here, Kaylee, on this GDP day that leads the White House to say what recession?
Well, that's exactly right. Growth is still strong, hanging in there. The question is, can it continue to do so in this election year? And a lot of things are complicated by the fact that it's election year, Joe, including trying to make a deal on the border. We have a lot of questions now about the fate of the deal attempting to be made between Senate negotiators and the White House, especially when you have former President Trump chiming in. And that's something that Republican Senator Mitt Romney of Utah spoke with reporters about earlier today.
Former President Trump has indicated to senators that he does not want us to solve the problem at the border. He wants to lay the blame for the border at Biden. And the idea that someone running for president would say, please hurt the country so I can blame my opponent and help my politics is a shocking development.
Speaking as maybe only a retiring Republican senator could there. Joining us now around the table, Bloomberg's Megan Scully and Jonathan Tamari of Bloomberg Government. It's great to have both of you here. We woke up to headlines this morning coming from a closed-door meeting Mitch McConnell had with Republican members of the Senate, in which he made clear that Donald Trump was going to influence the outcome of this border debate, Jonathan. Some reporting would suggest that it was a dead deal, but negotiators are continuing, and now Bloomberg reports that Mitch McConnell supports the continuation of these talks. So where are we?
Yeah, I think what we've heard from Republican senators today is say that, yes, McConnell was acknowledging the political reality that there's a real challenge to any deal here, but he wasn't saying this deal is off, this deal is dead. And there are a number of Republicans who came out today and said they want to get something done. They see this as a once-in-a-generation chance to actually get some of their tougher border policies enacted. And they don't think that opportunity will be there after this election because Democrats won't have the same political needs, and the Ukraine aid may not be on the table at that point as well. So you might not have the Democratic votes for this after the election this year.
And of course, Megan, the Senate's just one piece of the puzzle. Our question always has been about the House. Maybe now we have questions about the Senate, too. But the idea being, even if there was a deal to be made between these Senate negotiators and the White House, how was Speaker Johnson ever going to be able to put it on the floor and get enough votes?
House Republicans really want to stick with their own version of the bill, which is a Republican-only bill, which is extremely different than the compromise that senators are trying to hatch. So this will really hinge on Johnson, who is under pressure from Trump to not proceed with any deal that comes out of the Senate. A deal would probably pass the House on the backs of Democrats and about half of the Republican caucus. But putting that vote on the floor is up to Mike Johnson. And if he doesn't want it, it's not going to be on the floor.
Well, you're starting to get questions about anything that could be described as progress, whether it's on a border deal or now this tax deal, Jonathan, that we've been talking about quite a bit, bicameral, bipartisan. But we're hearing from members on both sides of the aisle in the Senate Finance Committee that they want to mark up on this thing, which would likely make it impossible to pass it before tax season, which they wanted to do, tax filing season, if at all. Could this maybe be on the rocks, too?
Yeah, I mean, it's a deal that's been negotiated by the leaders of the committees, and now the members of the committees, the individual rank-and-file members, are taking a look, and they want their priorities addressed. And there's a lot of different ways for conservatives are concerned about the child tax credit, that may be too much refundability for their liking. There are Republicans and Democrats from high-tax states like New York and New Jersey who want the state and local tax deduction restored in some way. So everybody's going to want a piece of this if this is one of the few bills that's actually moving through Congress this year. So, yeah, there's a lot of extra steps that could come to this tax deal as well.
Does that make it less likely?
It certainly makes it more challenging, certainly makes it harder to do it very quickly. I mean, the question, if they can do it next week to get ahead of tax filing season, it's a really difficult one to forecast right now. It faces a lot of hurdles for sure.
So if they can't figure out how to get a bipartisan tax deal actually across the finish line, if they can't figure out how to get a potential bipartisan compromise on the border and Ukraine aid across the finish line, how are we ever, Jonathan, going to sort out funding the government beyond March?
Well, that's one where they seem to have, where both sides seem to not want a shutdown. I mean, it's an election year, so people are really wary of giving wins to the other side. A not shutdown kind of serves everybody. Republicans are worried about getting blamed for that, and they've at least agreed to the top line deal. It seems like that is something they'll get done at some point, but anything beyond kind of keeping the lights on does become really difficult in an election year.
I can talk to us more about the influence that Donald Trump is or is not having on all of these conversations in the House and the Senate. The line from Mitch McConnell was, we don't want to do anything to undermine him. He referred to Donald Trump as the nominee.
Yes. Should
we not also be looking at him as the leader of the Republican Party on Capitol Hill?
Yeah, well, I don't know that he has ever not been. He cast a long shadow since leaving office. But I do get the sense on the Hill, particularly coming out of New Hampshire, there's an inevitability surrounding his nomination. He's picking up support on the Hill. And with that, his weighing in on legislation has a newfound power, one that it didn't have with people like Mitch McConnell and perhaps even some of the negotiators on this border deal. They see him as the next president, or at least the next GOP nominee for the presidency, which makes him the leader of the party. And what he says, he can really tip the scales in terms of which way this legislation is going to go. But he has this running back and forth with Mitch McConnell. The two of them have not always seen eye to eye. And Mitch McConnell is going to try to keep this deal alive because he wants to get that funding to Ukraine, which is key to this. Ukraine will not get funded without a border deal.
Yeah, you start wondering, Kayleigh, if he's laying the groundwork for a standalone Ukraine funding bill, knowing that this border deal just might not happen.
Well, we know Mitch McConnell is a tactician, a proven one, so potentially this is him trying to negotiate perhaps more publicly than usual. Just on the idea of Trump being the leader, Megyn, finally, the real leader of the House of Representatives is supposed to be the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson. Is the one potential upside of not getting these deals done the idea that he won't have to put them on the floor and potentially risk the gavel, that maybe he just remains Speaker until we have a Congress in 2025?
Yes. I mean, doing nothing definitely works to Mike Johnson's political advantage. It's the doing something, the border and Ukraine, that really puts him in jeopardy if Republicans don't get all of what they want. Funding the government is also difficult for him because he's really hamstrung by these hardliners. Even the tax deal is difficult because hardliners don't want to give Joe Biden a leg up on this, and because, as John pointed out, moderate Republicans, particularly those in New York and New Jersey, are very upset that the SALT tax was not increased as part of this deal. So he's getting it from both ends there. So doing nothing is definitely perhaps his preferred strategy, but that also makes him a weaker speaker.
I was going to say, doing nothing when your job is technically to legislate just kind of speaks to how broken Congress may find itself at this current moment in time. Bloomberg's Megyn Scully and Jonathan Tamari of Bloomberg Government, thank you both so much for joining us. Now, coming up, we'll turn to the subject of the U.S. economy as GDP tops estimates by a lot in the fourth quarter. We'll get reaction from the White House next with senior advisor to the president, Gene Sperling. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg.
Just last week, we saw the biggest jump in 30 years in how positive consumers are feeling about the economy. Things are finally beginning to sink in. We passed a lot of really good legislation. We knew it was going to take time for it to begin to take hold, but it's taken hold now and turning the economy around.
The U.S. economy's fourth quarter growth surging past forecasts as cooling inflation fueled consumer spending, capping a surprisingly strong year that defied calls for a recession. Joining us now to discuss is Gene Sperling, White House American Rescue Plan Coordinator and Senior Advisor to the President. Mr. Sperling, thank you so much for joining us this
evening.
For having me. Obviously, the U.S. economy surprised many last year in terms of its strength. There was a chorus of calls for a recession. Often we see that groupthink, though, is wrong. Now it seems that the groupthink is around this idea of a soft landing. Do you see any risk out there that that landing may not be as soft as we all think right now?
Well, you know, I mean, you can't overstate your opening there. There was, as you know, Times survey showed 100% of economists predicting 100% chance of recession, and instead we're closing a year where you just saw 3.3% growth in the fourth quarter. You've seen now 3.4% growth on average since President Biden's been in. But I'll tell you, as someone who's been around a while, when you see a surprise strong GDP number, 3.3% growth, you see inflation, PCE inflation at 2%, core down, and you see disposable real incomes up 4.2%. I mean, that's a little that's better than normal, even Goldilocks. That's kind of Goldilocks plus. So, for us, yes, it is confirming of the fact that we believe that having a strong recovery and strong investment plan would actually lead to a more resilient economy that would have more growth and more resilience both at the consumer, the state, local level. And, here we are now, the country that has both the highest growth, the highest real wage growth, and the lowest inflation in the G7. I mean, that's, is that good enough? No, it's not good enough because there's a lot of families that even though they may know intellectually that this was global inflation and the U.S.'s inflation was lower, it still hurts when you go through that gas pump or grocery line and you feel like it's taken a bigger part of your paycheck. But now I think it is starting to sink in that things are looking better, that some prices are not just moderating, but they're actually coming down. And some people might be frustrated that some things are still maybe higher than they were in 2020. Sure. But I think,
you have to say that,
in the
though,
consumer
right,
confidence, you're starting to see the biggest uptick in the last 2 months. Still not high enough, but it does give you a sense that this is starting to sink in among average working families.
We're going to talk to Betsey Stevenson from the University of Michigan right after this conversation, Gene. I know that you have to, kind of express appreciation for what people are feeling now. But if I can just kind of turn Kayleigh's question around and ask it a little bit differently. After hearing economists predict a recession for essentially the last 2 years, can't you stand confidently on the north lawn of the White House tonight and tell our listeners and viewers that the Biden administration found a way around a recession and there's not going to be one this year?
I mean, you never want to make 100% predictions when you have everything. But, I mean, when you look right now, it's not a soft landing. It's really no landing at all. I mean, again, 3 years in a row, averaging 3.4%. It was 2.5% average, 3.1% year over year. Those are strong, solid numbers. And you're now still under 4% for the longest stretch in over 50 years. So, yes, I think we feel very good about the strategy that we've had. And I think we learned good lessons from the last time, which is make sure when you have a recovery and investment plan, it has a cushion for people, that you don't have state, local pulling back, that consumers have a little extra buffer. We saw JP Morgan today say that in people's accounts, they still have more than they did pre-pandemic. This kind of investment in jobs, this resilience, providing people, as the president says, a little breathing room, I think it has really worked. I think a lot of the economists were wrong and didn't realize the unique circumstances. So, yes, we feel very good. But we also, we never want to underappreciate that a lot of people, it's still been a tough few years with the pandemic and the inflation people saw. We appreciate that. We want them to know, hey, we appreciate that some things can still be hurting. Some prices might seem high, but we're fighting. We're the one. President Biden back here is the one who's fighting for lower drug costs, insulin at $35, lower health care premiums for 20, 30 million Americans. We're the ones that are fighting to still bring your costs lower.
Well, and one of the things that may help at least Americans that have children at home could be an expansion of the child tax credit. Obviously, there has been a bipartisan, bicameral deal to do just that, in addition with some tax breaks for businesses in Congress. But we're seeing right now that the fate of bipartisan deals isn't always necessarily a good one, perhaps on border security and Ukraine aid as well. Certainly on funding, it's been hard to actually get a budget done. It still hasn't been done. Jean, how do you think about the tax deal or anything else getting over the finish line in this Congress in particular? Is the White House a bit powerless here?
Well, we have a president who never gives up on bipartisan opportunities. And in fact, let's remember that two of his major plans, the infrastructure legislation and the CHIPS Act, were both bipartisan. So, of course, we never stop trying. Obviously, we're trying now for bipartisan border and Ukraine legislation. That's important. We're still working. We're still hoping for the best. On the tax deal, this is what the president said before, that he wasn't going to let, a corporate tax deal go through unless it was helping the child tax credit. What happened, the thing I'm most proud of in the American Rescue Plan was the child tax credit, how it helped working families and it lowered poverty to historic levels. The fact you have a bipartisan agreement to do that, I think is significant. And so we are hopeful. And I know there's still the question, what will be attached to? But remember, it passed in the House committee 40-3. So we're going to keep hope because millions of children, millions of working families will benefit, will have a little extra in their pocket to help. And we know how much that would mean. So, anything bipartisan is tough in this political environment in an election year. But we're going to look for every opportunity because ultimately, Americans want us to get things done that help them lower costs, their pocketbook, their ability to support their family with security and dignity and respect.
Maybe we should be encouraged that somebody just marked up a bill. Jean, thanks. It's great to see you from the White House. Jean Sperling tonight on Bloomberg. For more on the economy, we turn now to Betsey Stevenson, professor of public policy and economics at the University of Michigan. It's good to see you, Betsey. As we talk about this blow the doors off GDP report today, again, it reminds us of where we are in terms of consumer sentiment and politically the Biden administration trying to connect the dots here between just more positive economic data and what appears to be confusion when it comes to public polling or downright rejection. Yet we have seen consumer confidence on the rise. Will that continue through this year?
I hope that it continues through this year. I mean, we had just an unbelievably strong year of strong economic growth, very low unemployment, and inflation that came down to where we actually want it to be. It really was just win, win, win. Every economy in every country and every year is always at risk of a recession. So, anytime anyone's asked to guarantee that a recession won't come, you're just asking for trouble because you got to keep your eye on the ball. And I was certainly pleased to hear Jean Sperling say, you just don't know. And that's why they're just going to keep plugging away at it because we don't know what could happen next. But if things keep going on the way they have been going on, I think consumers will start to recover their confidence to see, look, we still have plenty of jobs. We still have money in the bank. Inflation's coming down and real wages have grown. The bottom line is families are better off today than they were in 2019, most of them.
Well, and earlier today, Betsey, we heard from Secretary of the Treasury Janet Yellen speaking specifically about middle-class families and what the Biden administration has done to try to invest in them and better their economic circumstances. Just take a listen, if you will, to her speaking at the Economic Club of Chicago earlier.
The story of the middle class is not separate from the state of the economy. It is at the heart of it. Overall, the Biden administration has put in place the most extensive set of policies and investments to benefit the middle class and grow the economy that our country has seen in my lifetime.
But the thing about investments, Betsy, is that often they take a while to pay off. And certainly we are starting to see an uptick in sentiment. But how much of the policies that this administration has passed, surely Inflation Reduction Act, other efforts as well, have actually been realized and are now felt in pocketbooks? How much is there a lagged effect still to consider here?
Well, there's obviously a lagged effect because the money hasn't all been spent, the projects haven't all been done, but they're all getting started and they're creating strong economies in places where we have traditionally not had strong economies. So if you look at the money from the Inflation Reduction Act, so much of it has gone to rural communities or communities that have tended not to do as well as other communities. So there is a purposeful push to strengthen all of America. You know, I think what the Biden administration is trying to do is point out that this myth we've been told for years that there are just a few job creators out there and we need to give them all sorts of tax cuts so we can convince them to keep creating jobs. That's a myth. What we need is a strong and vibrant economy that everybody can participate in. And coming out of COVID, we've really seen that. You heard Gene Sperling talking about supporting families with things like the child tax credit, with things like the support to unemployment insurance and the stimulus checks during the pandemic. All of that left the typical household with more money in the bank than they had before. And what we have seen is the strongest rate of the business creation that we've seen in a very, very long time. I didn't think we could see such a surge in new business formation. So it turns out that the job creators are not just a tiny handful of people who need some big tax cuts. It was actually all of us who could decide at any moment to open a very small business, perhaps have that business grow. I think it's been that kind of dynamism, the dynamism that's come from everyday Americans trying to meet the needs of other everyday Americans by starting new businesses, that has led to an explosion of growth around the country. We're not done with that. And my hope is that people will continue to see and reap the rewards from that over the coming year.
Betsy, you're joining us from Michigan, where economic conditions are going to play in directly to the result of this presidential election. It's one reason why we talked to you. And, of course, the president was there for a very important endorsement from the head of the UAW, Shawn Fain. Let's hear from the president at that event before we ask you more about it. Here he is.
I kept my commitment to be the most pro-union president ever. I'm proud you have my back. Let me just say I'm honored to have your back and you have mine. That's the deal.
We saw Joe Biden walk the picket line as the president of the United States. So not a shock, I guess, to see this endorsement in return. I just wonder, what do the rank and file union members living in Michigan think about this, many of whom voted for Donald Trump in the last election?
You know, I think that's the challenge, is that many of them do support Donald Trump. But at the end of the day, when it came time for them to strike, to get, record contracts to reflect record profits was their motto, Donald Trump was nowhere to be seen, and President Biden was walking the picket line. It's the support of unions that comes from society and government that allowed that record contract. So it doesn't surprise me that he was able to get that endorsement. And the hope is that the endorsement starts conversations that allow those rank and file members who perhaps have been Trump supporters to ask questions about what Biden has actually done to improve their lot versus what they got from a Trump presidency. I don't think any single endorsement is going to, get everybody on board, but it's obviously really important to show that there is a strong union support for President Biden, and he is a strong union president.
Yeah, he says he's the strongest in history. Our thanks to Betsey Stevenson of the University of Michigan. We appreciate your time this evening. Now, coming up, we'll focus more on the race for the White House this year and a number of Senate races to watch as well. Kondik will be with us in just a moment. This is Bloomberg.
And so he got upset and he said that he would take one and he'd challenge me to one and that he would beat me. Maybe he would, maybe he wouldn't. But what I said is, okay, well, if that's the case, then get on a debate stage and let's go.
Nikki Haley last night in her home state of South Carolina, reflecting on former President Trump's claims to have recently aced a cognitive test. Person, woman, man, camera, TV. We turn now to Kyle Kondik, managing editor at Sabato's Crystal Ball at the University of Virginia Center for Politics. Nice to see you post New Hampshire, Kyle. I wonder if you could give us your thoughts on what's real here. Nikki Haley says she's staying in the race. She's got a big meeting with donors next week. But Donald Trump is threatening donors that they'll be blacklisted if they give her money. And obviously, we've seen a rush by many others in the party to close this down. If the polling doesn't change more in her favor in South Carolina, will she drop out before that primary?
Well, look, no one wants to perform poorly in their home state. And I think that South Carolina is just demographically a lot less friendly to Nikki Haley than New Hampshire was. New Hampshire, fair amount of independent voters, a lot of moderate, self-described moderate, and even liberal voters compared to many other Republican primary contests. Yes, South Carolina is kind of more like Iowa. It's more religious, it's more conservative, and Trump just does a lot better with those kinds of voters than Nikki Haley does. I mean, part of Haley's problem here is that she's trying to win the Republican presidential primary, but she doesn't have the support from that many people who call themselves Republicans. Which she did really well amongst described independents, but amongst self-identified Republicans / registered Republicans in New Hampshire, Trump got, I think, 70% or so of those voters. And, New Hampshire sort of stands out as a state where it's easy for independents to participate, and a lot of independents do participate. South Carolina is, it's functionally an open primary too, but it's not a state that has that sort of tradition of kind of crossover voting, and again has a much more conservative electorate as well. I think she's in trouble in South Carolina. I think she really needed to do better in New Hampshire.
Well, and to your point about the New Hampshire demographics being more in her favor, that's really hard to replicate in any other future contest, right? New Hampshire is so unique with that 40% base of undeclared voters. I know her campaign was pointing to the fact that there are open or semi-open primaries on 11 of the 16 Super Tuesday states, but do you really realistically see a state that she could outright win?
If you look at the exit polling from 2016 and look at the states that are coming up, states that have primaries, South Carolina, Michigan, and then a bunch of states on Super Tuesday on March 5th, those states in terms of self-identified moderates, a lot of them are only around 20% of the electorate. New Hampshire was more like 35, roughly speaking, and so they're just a lot more conservative than New Hampshire is. And so that's that's where Haley is in the party. She's doing well amongst moderates. She's doing well amongst independents, but there just aren't enough of them in these upcoming contests to really give her much of a shot of finishing first. And we're starting to get to the point where, Iowa and New Hampshire were the delegates proportionally. South Carolina is not technically winner take all, but it's winner take all statewide. And then also by congressional district, Donald Trump got 32% there, or 32 or 33 in 2016, but he won every single delegate. Obviously, it's just different kind of race. It's really just a two-person race at this point. But Haley would have to get really close to Trump in the overall statewide vote to even have a chance of winning delegates at the congressional district level. And so the delegate math starts to get daunting because you're moving away from these proportional contests to, winner take most or effectively kind of winner take all, or states that have a winner take all trigger.
Well, so what are we talking about here then, Kyle? Even Mitch McConnell is referring to Donald Trump as the nominee. Isn't this over?
I mean, for all intents and purposes, it sure seems that way. Now, I guess something could happen that would upset the apple cart here. But, Trump just has way more support within the party than Haley does. And again, even in a state that, again, I think was pretty favorable to Haley compared to many other Republican states, she did decently well, but she did finish particularly close to Trump. And I think these other states are going to be less forgiving.
Mm-hmm.
So if we're potentially right now in a general election that's going to be 9.5 months long, historic, at least for modern political times. I wonder if the actual interesting part of this election cycle is not actually going to be the presidential contest, but the contest down the ballot, the balance of the House and the Senate. Kyle, is it your expectation that we're going to see a flip happen? Democrats control the House, but they lose the Senate because of some very vulnerable Democrats that currently are holding seats.
Yeah, it's actually within the realm of possibility that you could see something I think would be unprecedented, which was that you've got, the presidency, the Senate, and the House, that all three of them could change hands in November. The race for the presidency, the race for the Senate, and the race for the House are close enough that you could actually conceivably see that happen. Republicans probably should win the Senate. They basically have a guaranteed pickup with the retirement of Joe Manchin in West Virginia. So if that happened and nothing else changed, that would make the Senate 50-50. And then Republicans just need one more seat for an outright majority. They've got, Trump won states, Ohio and Montana they're targeting, and then a bunch of kind of marginal Biden won states that have Democratic Senate incumbents. So, the targets are right there for the Republicans. The Democrats don't really have that many opportunities to play offense themselves. So the Senate is there for the Republicans, but of course, we've seen them mess it up in the past.
You mentioned Ohio and Montana, Kyle. How much danger are John Tester and Sherrod Brown in this cycle?
Look, I think those are both, toss-up races. Now, we've seen this increasing correlation between Senate and presidential results. And in both 2016 and 2020 of the states that held Senate races in those years, only one Senate race out of either 2016 or 2020 voted for a senator for one party and president for the other. And that was when Susan Collins, Republican of Maine, won re-election, and Biden won Maine in 2020. That was it. And so these kind of crossover state senators are becoming more and more rare. And, the two on the ballot still are Tester in Montana and Brown in Ohio. And so it's just a heavy lift because, again, you'd expect the Republicans to win those states for president, and probably not just by a couple of points.
All right, Kyle Kondik, thank you as always for joining us from Sabato's Crystal Ball. We appreciate your time. Now coming up, speaking of 2024 and the individuals who are competing in it, former President Trump putting pressure on Congress to stop a border deal. Our political panel will join us next on that. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. And the conversation in the hallways of Congress on whether a border package may pass seems to be a complicated one, perhaps growing more complicated in recent days as we try to dissect the messaging of the Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell. But in the meantime, there is a lot happening on the border, specifically in Texas. And Bloomberg's Julie Fine actually talked to the Texas Governor Greg Abbott earlier on the immigration issue. Take a listen.
What's important is for the federal government, so I'm talking about the executive branch as well as the legislative branch, to fix a broken border. Texas is doing everything that we can by building border walls, erecting more than 100 miles of razor wire, having the National Guard deployed constantly, with Texas taxpayers spending more than $10 billion already to secure the border. And what we have is Joe Biden not enforcing the laws already on the books, allowing this outrageous parole of people who've crossed the border, telling them to come back for a court hearing in 10 years is outrageous. And so it's essential that both the executive branch and the Congress work effectively to secure our border. This is all caused by Joe Biden's refusal to enforce the immigration laws that are already in effect. And as long as there are illegal immigrants crossing our border that Biden is not stopping, Texas, in order to alleviate congestion in small little towns like Del Rio and Eagle Pass, we will continue busing migrants to cities across the entire country. I was in a meeting on the border with mayors, county judges, police chiefs, sheriffs, et cetera, and they were talking about how their community had been overrun with migrants dropped off by the Border Patrol. They said they couldn't handle it anymore. I said I would help them out by beginning this busing process. And it has alleviated the congestion in small little towns on the border and has spread those migrants across the entire country.
Texas Governor Greg Abbott speaking earlier today with Bloomberg's Texas Bureau Chief Julie Fine. We're joined now around the table by our political panel. Jim Kessler, Third Way Executive Vice President, and Sarah Chamberlain, Republican Main Street Partnership President and CEO. It's wonderful to have you both back at the table. Jim, I've got to start with you. You worked for Chuck Schumer and you know the ways of Mitch McConnell. The reporting was across the board today. People woke up thinking the border deal was dead. And the line that stuck out from a closed-door meeting with his members, we don't want to do anything to undermine him, referring to Donald Trump. What was he trying to do there?
Well, I think, look, this border deal is good for 340 million Americans, and it's bad for one, and that one American is Donald Trump. Look, I think that what Mitch McConnell did yesterday, saying this deal is in trouble, was trying to rally his side by saying, like, we've got to stand up for this, because McConnell does want this deal. I was talking to a Democratic senator last night who's a centrist. He says, I think there's a 50-50 chance this deal gets done. I know McConnell wants it to get done. I know Schumer wants it to get done. Donald Trump does not want this deal to get done because it hurts him. It helps everybody else.
Well, and certainly plenty of people on Capitol Hill had words about this today, including Republican Senator Mitt Romney, who told reporters why he believes Trump is attempting to stop this thing. Take a listen.
I think the border is a very important issue for Donald Trump, and the fact that he would communicate to Republican senators and congresspeople that he doesn't want us to solve the border problem because he wants to blame Biden for it is really appalling.
But, Sarah, it's not just senators he's communicating with. He has a very close relationship with the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson. Even if Mitch McConnell were to galvanize enough support together with other bipartisan negotiators on the Senate side, did this thing ever stand a real chance in the House of Representatives?
Very questionable. I would give it less than 50-50 odds, to be honest with you. Some are supportive of it, but to be honest with you, we really haven't even seen what the deal is. So it's really hard to say, yes, we'd support it or we wouldn't support it. But what we do know is when Trump was president, it was much calmer. So Biden has kind of let this get out of control.
But if Trump were to be president again, realistically, what is the chance of getting a border deal passed if you need 60 votes in the Senate? Why would Democrats give him this if Biden wasn't given it this year?
And they probably wouldn't. And here we go back in the circular.
It goes round.
Right, and it goes around and round. I mean, we have this constantly in Washington.
So I hate to be the downer here, Jim, but it's sounding like the government might shut down or we'll get another CR, but no real budget to finish out this fiscal year. We understand the tax deal could be on the rocks because they're calling for a markup now that would slow it down, if not kill it. The border could be crashing here. Sarah Chamberlain tells me less than 50-50, not sounding great. It has no chance in the House, we're told. Is the store closed for the rest of the year? This is truly a Congress that's broken.
It's a broken Congress, but I still think, I don't think the government is going to shut down. I do think we'll get some sort of tax deal. A border deal is going to be tough. It is not impossible. Look, if Mike Johnson got a border deal done, he has a chance to keep his majority. There's something you can take home. Republicans have nothing to take home. You could do that. But he wants to serve Donald Trump, not lead his caucus.
Well, but there's also the question, do you keep the majority but lose your chance to lead that majority? Because you have the likes of Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene saying, if you put this thing on the floor and it includes Ukraine aid, motion to vacate, we're going to try to kick you out again. I mean, is this the choice here?
It is the choice there, and there's no one to replace the Speaker, who, by the way, is doing a very good job. It is a thankless job. I mean, it really is. And who would replace him? I mean, the Democrats, I still go back, and I've said it many times, I still go back to this. The Democrats are equally to blame for this problem. They should have saved Kevin when they had the chance. And then we could have got some good policy done. But here we sit. We are in disarray. And depending upon the day, we have one or two seat majority. So it's really tough, and the Speaker's doing the best job that he can, but it's a hard road, and the government will not shut down. I do not think we're going to get a tax bill, though. We're going to certainly try, but I don't think we're going to get a farm bill.
Wow. Well, okay, so we were just talking to Kyle Kondik about potential down-ballot effects. Coming out of these two primaries, or caucus and primary, Mitch McConnell's calling Donald Trump the nominee. If that's the case, what do members of the Main Street Partnership say? What does that do for the Republican majority as it stands now in the House?
Well, we're confident we are going to keep the majority, maybe even expand it by a couple seats. You know, a lot of our districts, they live in Biden districts. We have 17 that do. They run on who they are and what they support. And Trump is kind of on the side. They don't talk much about him. It's what they're doing for their constituents and what they're bringing home. And if their constituents like them. I mean, that's a key thing. A lot of people, when they're asked in the polls, they don't like Congress, but they like their member. And that's what keeps the Main Street members here.
So this is a non-factor for you?
It's kind of a non-factor for us. But though I do agree, I think Donald Trump is the nominee.
Okay, well, he isn't officially yet. So Sarah Chamberlain and Jim Kessler, hold your thoughts, because there is still another person in this race, Nikki Haley. And coming up, we'll discuss the fact that former President Trump is making threats on social media to big donors who back Haley. We'll be back with our political panel after this break. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Former President Trump is threatening to cut off donors who contribute to his opponent for the Republican nomination, Nikki Haley. In a True Social post last night, he wrote, quote, "Anybody that makes a contribution to Haley from this moment forth will be permanently barred from the MAGA camp." Our political panel is back with us, Jim Kessler and Sarah Chamberlain. So, Sarah, first of all, I don't even know how we would define the MAGA camp, what exactly it is they could be cut off from. Is this just another retribution threat to the typical donation process, which is how politics has always worked?
I think it's President Trump blowing off steam. And the reality is those people who are funding Nikki Haley are not in the mega camp. Yeah. So I don't think it really bothers them that they won't be allowed into the mega camp. I mean, they are the old-style Republicans, and they're continuing to fund her, and I think that they're comfortable with that.
Well, yeah, what is this allowed? Maybe you can help me out here. I'm a very simple-minded person, Jim. If a donor has money and they like your ideas, they give you that money. These are donors who do not like Donald Trump. Is he suggesting that their money will not be allowed as some sort of pay-for-play thing? Why would, if they don't like Donald Trump, want to be in the MAGA camp?
I think the word we're looking for here is extortion.
Okay, fine.
I think he's basically saying, if you're one of my enemies,
you can't
intra-bureau within the party, it's not that I'm going to make sure, if I'm elected in my 4 years, I'm going to make your life difficult, your company's life difficult, your friends' life. Like, that's what he's going to do. That's who Donald Trump is. And, you know, it's a threat that he actually does a pretty good job of keeping. So it's one of his...
Remarkable.
You know.
Well, and I guess for donors, though, it's not just a calculation of, OK, how's Trump going to react? What kind of, retaliation could I face? It's also just a question of whether you're throwing good money after bad at this point for Nikki Haley, right? I mean, is there a real risk for her that the spigot turns off?
Yeah, I mean, what happens is when a candidate drops out of the race, it's because they don't have the money to continue to pay their staff, run ads, that sort of thing. That has not happened with her yet. I mean, she has to. South Carolina is 3 or 4 weeks away. Like, there's a long period of time here. She needs to somehow catch fire and do well in South Carolina. Well is winning delegates there and winning the state. Not easy. She's far behind. Not impossible, but not easy.
Let's be real about Nikki Haley for a moment. We keep asking, what's the path? Her campaign manager would tell you that she's going to go into other states that have open primaries. There's no state that's like New Hampshire on that level, though, and she couldn't really come close to winning it when we're talking of, about an 11 or so point spread. Unless the funding and the polling improves in South Carolina, how long could she keep this up?
Until her money runs out. I mean, I really think maybe she'll go through South Carolina. It looks like clearly if it's held today, she'll lose. Yeah. But if people are still willing to fund her, she'll keep going because she's building name ID. And in 4 years, no matter whom wins, Biden or Trump, it's going to be an open. Is that
what this is really about?
It could very well be. Yeah. Could very well be keeping her name out there. I don't know. But that's the only plan I think it would be. That's her strategy.
Well, there's also the consideration that the convention is still almost 6 months away. It's in July. In the meantime, you have a former president who was in a courtroom today in a civil case. It's about how much money he's going to have to pay E. Jean Carroll for defaming her. But he is potentially going to be on trial here in Washington the day before Super Tuesday. Could this also be a calculation that there is a real risk of potential prison time for the former president? And if you have some delegates to show maybe that's your chance to swoop in, Sarah.
It certainly could be, and she is the only other one that has delegates, so it may be. I don't know what her plan is, but right now I don't see a path, but there's a lot of things that could happen in politics.
How much does the Biden campaign love that we're having this conversation right now?
I think they'd love if this conversation was going on longer,
Okay.
through Super Tuesday, that it was a true fight there. Donald Trump, he didn't do great in New Hampshire. The way the delegate allocation process works in the Republican primary, doing well enough means you're doing very, very well. But if you think of him as an incumbent, his numbers weren't great in Iowa, and his numbers weren't great in New Hampshire for Donald Trump. There's some weakness there. The Biden people would like this to just take longer. I don't know if it will take longer, but they would like it to take longer.
But the Biden campaign came out after New Hampshire that night after the race was called and said it's clear Trump is the nominee and democracy is on the ballot, kind of used that language again. They seized on it very quickly.
Yeah, well, he's very likely the nominee. And, there are some long shots, like what could happen in a court case. I think that's a real long shot. Mm-hmm. Nikki Haley's got to play some long balls. I think immigration, the border deal is a place where she should draw a line and say it is a disgrace that Donald Trump is opposing this. I think she needs to draw some lines. If not, it's over fast.
That's fascinating. Should Nikki Haley endorse the border deal?
I don't know, because I haven't seen the border deal. I mean, we keep talking about it, but reality is we really haven't seen it yet.
Listen, that's a fair reminder. We should tell our audience we don't even have a text yet.
Yep.
Great conversation with Jim Kessler and Sarah Chamberlain. And thanks for spending time with us. Check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power. We'll be back here tomorrow on Bloomberg TV and radio.